All right, we'll call the meeting to order. This is the budget public hearing. We should have roll call.
We should have roll call.
I normally forget it. I'm so proud of myself for remembering it.
I will start. Supervisor Harris,
I am present.
Supervisor Jesse,
Here.
Supervisor Williams,
Here.
Supervisor Kuntz, Supervisor Kimbrough.
Here.
We do have a quorum. Thank you. I'm done.
Thank you. So our business today is to present the proposed budgets and to hear public comment on the budget. And Matt, I'll turn it over to you.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, we are here tonight to have our 2023 Middlesex County budget public hearing. We're also going to have the Middlesex County Public Schools budget as proposed by the board. The public hearing on the tax rate and consideration of the budget will be on April 28th at 7 o'clock in this same room. So I'm going to discuss tonight briefly the proposed revenues, the key changes and adjustments to those, also the proposed expenditures, the key changes to those, and of course the Board of Supervisors proposed school budget and capital improvement projects. And as I stated earlier, the proposed tax rates will go to public hearing next week on April 28th, 7 o'clock in this room. The board will have that public hearing, close the public hearing, have public comment, of course, and then consider the budget and/or making any budget adoptions next week. The board cannot adopt the budget tonight. So this is a public hearing on the budget itself. First of all, just briefly, a little bit on the budget process. The school and county staff began work on this budget as early as October, September of last year, 2021. The board began work on the budget at their first budget work session, kickoff session, the January 7th work session. It's known as our strategic budget work session because you get updates from various agencies like the Hampton Road Sanitation District's update on the sewer projects, the Water Authority's update on the water system project, and last but definitely not least, especially this year because staff did receive a lot of robust input from the board about the board's goals and objectives for the 2003 budget. And to the extent practicable, where staff saw a great degree of consensus and overlap in those goals and objectives, we tried to incorporate them into this budget, and we think we've been fairly successful with that, working with the board, of course. Board continued to work with staff on the budget. The last work session we had on it was April 5th, where it was pretty much solidified and sent to public hearing. A separate public hearing is being held on the tax rates. Again, that's scheduled for April 28th. I think I've said that 3 times, but it bears repeating. And of course, this advertisement allows the budget to be adopted prior to May 1st. Key revenue topics this year. Real quick, real estate tax. Last year, the board had some input from the county assessor that we were due for a fairly substantial increase in real estate taxes. That has occurred. The board has proposed the budget, proposing dropping the real estate tax rate to 61 cents from the current 62. However, due to the assessed value increase, that still equates to about an increase of 6 cents per 100. More on that a little later, and of course next week as well. Real personal property taxes. The Board of Supervisors are considering adopting an increase in personal property tax on boats over 5 tons from the current rate of 62 cents per 100 to 98 cents per 100, which is the rate currently on boats under 5 tons and boat motors and jet skis. This is an increase of 36 cents per 100 assessed value. The big story in revenue topics, as we see it from staff's perspective, is last year the budget had a fairly substantial reliance on ARPA funding and revenue from fund balance, or our reserves, to balance the budget. Revenues from fund balance, the reliance on those decreased from 1.3 million to 0 in this budget. And as the board may recall in last year's budget deliberations, we had expectations that the assessed value was going to increase substantially. So rather than have a preemptive tax increase to balance the budget last year, it was felt we have a healthy fund balance, bring that money in from fund balance, and let's see what happens with the reassessment, and maybe the reassessment will pull us out of that hole. And according to this budget, it has, as proposed. Also, revenues from ARPA, the reliance on those decreased from $354,000 to $126,000 for eligible expenses, and I'll point those out in a moment. If that story is not big enough, the big one is the organic revenue growth that we're seeing from real personal property and real property. Even before the assessment was brought into the picture, as I displayed in a couple of work sessions, we were seeing an uptick in development renovation, and that was adding to the real estate values on the books. And of course, everyone's familiar with the increase in values of trucks, vehicles, and the like. That had a robust bump for the county as well. It's the first time in many years that we've seen that type of organic revenue growth. I'm happy to see it. It's a sign of a healthier economy. When your revenues pretty much stay flat and you don't see a lot of that organic growth between assessments, it's not a good sign. Last but not least is the cigarette tax, which is doing an amazing amount for us. I think we were very impressed with the initial numbers. It continues to come in strong, and we're continuing to estimate that at about $200,000. What can I say? I think a lot of our campers come in from Maryland, and Maryland has a higher cigarette tax than we do, so they wait and buy their cartons down here when they come to the campgrounds, and we're glad they do. Wish they'd quit, but glad they do. So I'll highlight a couple of those key changes, as I briefly mentioned before. The real estate tax I've went over pretty much. Even by lowering the real estate tax a penny, it's still a fairly healthy increase in real property taxes. The increase in the personal property tax that you see is indicative of, one, the proposed increase in the boats over 5 tons, $154,000, I believe, approximately, and the organic growth in the values of cars, vehicles, and RVs and other personal property items. Other local taxes came in healthy too, the cigarette tax not the least of which. And the bottom tells the big story, where we had brought in $1.3 million to balance the budget last year. We did not need to bring in money from fund balance to balance the budget this year. We do have a new fund balance line item that I want to mention very quickly, and that's the fund balance for E911 radio system maintenance, the $170,000 that you see on your screen. This is a new fund balance because we had to bring in our monies that we had held in escrow with our lender, bring them into our fund balance basically, and we're piecemealing them out over the remaining years of the maintenance contract on the radio system. Routine maintenance, checking the system, calibrating it, and software upgrades. It was determined when we purchased the radio system that these are of paramount importance to keep your radio system current and not get behind on those types of items, because the more years you get behind, the more obsolete the system gets, and we wrapped all of that into the then financing. These proceeds come from fund balance to fund that. So not the general fund balance, but that set-aside fund balance for E911 radio system maintenance. Brings us total revenues of $31,303,977, a 6% increase over last year. Expenditure topics. The big one is that this budget does contain funding for a 7% cost of living adjustment for county and school staff, all employees. This is, as the board has discussed, primarily to help match the state's biennium proposal. We hope to get ahead of that this year, and therefore maybe just have a 3% increase if needed next year. That's built into the budget as advertised. The County Engineer Utilities Director Office. This budget, as I'll demonstrate in a moment, contains funding for a new position within administration for a county engineer / director of utilities. This position is co-funded by the Middlesex Water Authority to serve as their executive director. They pay for half of the compensation for the position. So it's very similar to what we arranged with the Water Authority in co-funding a new position in the treasurer's office to assist with billing and collections. Increased funding for county fire and rescue services. I want to spend a little bit of time on this one because I think it's warranted. It became aware to us over the course of the last year as we met with our volunteer fire and rescue services that they really have not seen a robust or dramatic increase in probably over 15 years. We asked our emergency services coordinator, Mr. David Lehman, to do a quick study of the surrounding counties and just to see how they were funding their volunteer rescue and fire system services. And indeed, we had fallen quite a bit behind. I think, if my memory serves, we were the lowest in the region in funding. And just explaining that, the more time our volunteers have to spend fundraising, the less time they spend training, and the more potential for burnout they may have. That's my 2 cents worth. I think it was overdue, and we have fully funded the ask from the volunteer fire and rescues. So that is an increase of $293,500 for the volunteer fire and rescue service. It's an increase of $282,000 for emergency services, which includes the $170,000 for radio system maintenance that comes from that set-aside fund balance, and $107,000 for the county's contracted crews that run 24/7 coverage for Urbana and the upper part of the county. So it is a healthy increase all around for fire and rescue services, timely in staff's opinion. Funding increase for non-departmental expenses. It was a substantial increase, primarily driven by the $154,000 in proposed funding for contingency. Should the boat tax be increased next week at the tax public hearing and the adoption of the tax rates, the money is contained in the contingency account for any unexpected circumstances that we may find ourselves in this coming year. Also in that line item is $167,000 per agreement with the Middlesex Economic Development Authority. That's a little tricky to explain. In short, we have funding that goes to the Middlesex Economic Development Authority, which is primarily the lodging tax revenue to help pay for the tourism and the marketing endeavors that they're engaged in. And then they return money to the county to pay for their staff that are carried on our books as our personnel, but report to the EDA. There's a little funding exchange there per agreement. I have discussed preliminarily with the interim Economic Development Administrator or Director and the incoming Director, the desire maybe to amend that agreement somewhat, and we'll be looking to do that as soon as he gets his feet on the ground and comes in. We feel like there's maybe some areas that could be changed to make it a little simpler, easier to understand, and probably reflect a little bit more of what the board wants and potentially the EDA board as well. Last but not least are the schools. The schools requested $11,169,803 in local funding for its operations this year. This budget includes $11,100,000. It's an increase of $728,000 and only approximately $70,000 shy of their ask. Feel like that's important because meeting the funding needs of the schools is always an important endeavor, but this year with the salary situation and the cost of living, especially so, and the ability to meet the state's biennium budget requirements. So in a little bit more detail, you'll notice that I hit the high point, so where you see the percentage increases we've kind of discussed. The administration line item increased roughly 18%, the majority of that. Cost of living increase, of course, but the $145,000 for the county engineer position in office. The next is fire and rescue, 69% increase, $293,500 over last year's. And of course, coming down to emergency services, the 40% increase of about $282,000 for the items I mentioned earlier. Next is our increase in school capital improvements increased dramatically, but I got to give credit where credit's due, and I think Dr. Sykes did come in today. Yep. They have done an amazing job funding a lot of their capital improvements, the majority of the total ask through grants. They're going to do a significant amount of paving and sealing. And of course, last year's capital improvements were relatively low. But hat tip to them, being very creative and being very on top of these grants. Grants can be a challenge in administering and going for and making sure you report accurately. I can't say enough about what a tremendous job they did this year with grants. They're really able to leverage. The way I look at the school capital improvements budget is we're leveraging 50 cents on every dollar we're paying them, almost more actually. And I guess that's one other thing of note that I did not mention in my talking points is the library did come in and ask for an increase of $30,000 this year to fund a part-time position to help drive their newly acquired library bus, or soon-to-be acquired library bus. We honored that request and funded that position. We're excited about that because the libraries had needed more money for many years, but this year seemed to align for them. So the proposed school budget, the FY23 budget was based on an ADM of 1,100. We believe last year's was 1,080, so gained a little bit. Key revenue items affecting the school budget, $6.5 million in state funding, estimated increase of $419,000, $855,000 in federal funding, that's an estimated increase of $53,000. Local funding of $11.1 million. Proposed increase in local funding of about $728,000, approximately $70,000 from what they asked. And local funding of the school debt service at the requested 1.146464. Net school general fund of $19.7 million. Total school food fund of $530,000. Total school textbook fund of $145,000. School capital improvements of $954,280. However, $530,000 of that is funded through grants. That brings direct grants to the school, by the way. Total school budget of $21,383,742. A little bit on capital improvements. Our school capital improvements, as I mentioned before, roughly $954,000. However, $530,000 of that is funded through direct grant funding to the school system, bringing our contribution to them to $424,000. County capital improvements line up to be about $531,000, partially funded through ARPA monies, and I'll show that in a moment. First of all, the school capital improvements include 2 new electric school buses, take advantage of those wonderful charging stations that we have. St. Clair Walker LED lighting upgrades to the tune of about $250,000. And the MES St. Clair Walker paving, sealing, parking lot improvements, which are grant funded. And that's the $530,000. County capital improvements include 2 sheriff's automobiles at $80,000, not each, total. The Cook's Corner Buddy Park, still working on a name for that, but Buddy Park sounds as good as about any. $50,000 for that. Financial system upgrade. This is one where we almost had unanimous overlap from the board about, hey, we need to do something. As John has said before, hey, Dot Matrix wants their printers back. 1980s are calling. We need to upgrade the financial software to get something a little bit more user-friendly and hopefully something a little bit more than the green sheets or blue sheets that I call them. So if the public calls in and says, hey, we want to see this, we can display to them a budget that doesn't take 30 minutes to explain what they're looking at. I'm excited about that. I know Anne Marie is. She's done some preliminary checking, and yeah, it's going to be a substantial project, but hopefully we can pull that off. $95,000 for the financial system upgrades. Water access property acquisition is a holdover. That's a typo. Disregard that. That was left over from last time. Thought I took that out. Sheriff's Office Puller Center reno at $180,000. That's the next item there. That is to kind of kickstart the renovation of the Puller Center for the sheriff's office to move to that location. It's an estimate. It may be a little bit more, maybe a little less, depending on how much we do and what we find. And last but not least is the bi-directional E911 amplifiers that Dave Lehman has been working with the schools on. These are amplifiers that allow our radio signal to be amplified throughout buildings, so there's better coverage of the radio system within these pretty dense, well-built buildings. $126,000 for that, and that is ARPA funded. So that's not coming out of local monies. That's my presentation, Mr. Chairman, and I'm here for questions after public comment.
Thank you, Matt. I'll now open the floor for public comment. Just a couple of notes on public comment on the budget. Each speaker will give your name and address for the record. Each speaker or individual will be given one opportunity to speak, and all comments will be addressed to the Board of Supervisors, not the audience. The address to the board is limited to 3 minutes unless you are speaking for a larger group that would need to be in attendance, so I don't think that we'll meet that criteria today. So I'll open the floor for public comment on the budget.
First, may the record show that Supervisor Kuntz did arrive at the beginning of Mr. Walker's presentation? Is that something we can do? Thank you.
Welcome. Do we have anybody that would like to address the board regarding the budget tonight?
I did not get any public speaker cards. Okay.
Going once? Very well, we appreciate your coming, and we'll have another event a week from tonight on the 28th when we're considering the tax rates. I'll close the public hearing. And that is our agenda.
Mr. Chair, do we have an opportunity to ask the administrator any questions from his presentation, or is we hold off on that?
I don't see any reason not to, John.
Okay, I just noticed two things. On the revenue side, I saw the airplane tax went up from $11,000 to $21,333 in revenue. Are we having significantly more traffic? Because I don't think we changed the airplane tax significantly enough to have it double.
There was no change to the personal property tax. The valuation and the number of items, I think, that are being captured increased.
Would you mind just circulating a memo to us, maybe with Betty's or
Absolutely.
somebody from the airplanes, give it a little more color and let us know, hey, is this something that is a really good news that we should be more aware of? And, if it's starting to go from a $10,000 revenue to a $20,000, what other opportunities are there for us to consider there? I mean, it's a real positive, and we should be aware of the details, I think. My last question is in three parts. The first one is rhetorical. When we propose to raise taxes of any nature, aren't we supposed to be able to say why we need more money from the community? So the reason I asked that question rhetorically is because I noticed we are raising potentially the boat tax and collecting significant revenue, and the best idea that we have, or what's been presented, is that it goes to contingency. So there goes my second question. This one I actually hope you have a response. What is our contingency balance historically, and is it greater or less than typical when we theoretically raise the boat tax and add this to our contingency? Do we normally carry what we're carrying, or did we just need that $200,000 to get to normal, or are we $200,000 above normal? Can you give us some color on how our contingency looks?
When we created the contingency line item several years ago, it has fluctuated, I believe, from a high of $250,000 down to a low of 0, I believe. Last year it was $20,000. This year we had it set at $20,000, but with the inclusion of the boat tax revenue, and that was kind of a placeholder because that decision was made at the last work session, and we wanted to balance the budget by putting that in there in the contingency line item. The board can move those funds to other locations as they choose. That's the purpose of contingency.
So summarizing, we don't have a long track record of the contingency line item, but to what extent we do, we're in the 20,000 region. And this, can you go to the expenses or where's the
Absolutely.
contingency? And let's just look at what it was last year versus this year, knowing that you said, I think 20,000 was typical contingency.
Right. And contingencies are located in, well,
I saw it somewhere. So we increase our contingencies by 154,000. So what we're telling the press and the public who are here to comment or not is that we need to raise taxes for 154,000. Our community needs that money. We're coming to you to assess a new tax or a different tax level because we need that money. And what we need it for is to outstrip our typical contingency once we've balanced all the other budget line items by 800 or 900%. We need it for that reason. So my point in asking that question is, and this is my final thing, and I'll be quiet. So we could just look at our biggest responsibility by department, line items, all the departments, they have an expense. What's our biggest departmental expense?
well, it depends on what you mean by department. 'Cause I
I'll
would say-
steer you. I'll continue to steer you. What do you
I would-
think I'm talking
I
about?
would say the transfer to the Middlesex Public Schools is the largest line item
Okay.
responsibility.
Okay, so let's say that at 10 million last year, 11 million this year, total budget at 31. I mean, I look at this sheet, I would call that our biggest expense. And so I say, well, just if we had $100,000, $200,000 that we don't have any other plan for but to put in contingency, and we just looked at our biggest responsibility, and we then just looked at what their biggest responsibility is financially, and they tell us every year when they come here, where does the majority of the money that we but allocate to the school board go? I think the answer is paying our teachers and staff. I think that's our number one expense.
I would say that's correct. The personnel cost for the schools, given the number of employees they have, is probably the largest expense they have.
And every year, consistently. So our biggest department's biggest expense is one that they come to us and they tell us based on their need that they need this much to be able to cover their biggest and all their expenses. But here we're talking about raising a tax to line a contingency item 900, maybe 1,000% more than our typical contingency. So it's not being used as a contingency the way we've historically used the contingency. But our biggest department's biggest expense, 5 or more years out of the last 10 years, has gone underfunded based on their need. So do we need to raise a tax so that we don't use that money on what the school tells us we need? And I don't know that anybody has an answer. I just want to point out that doesn't make sense. Why are we raising a tax to put money somewhere when we have people telling us they need it to operate and we tell them we don't have it? And I yield back.
All right, thank you.
I'm not sure he was asking me that question or the board, so I'm just going to remain quiet.
All right, we have completed our agenda. I will entertain a motion to adjourn. Motion by Mr. Jesse.
I so move.
Second.
Second by Mr. Koontz. Roll call, please.
Sorry about that. Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Supervisor Jesse? I should have said supervisor, sorry.
Yes.
Supervisor Williams?
Yes.
Supervisor Coons?
Aye.
Supervisor Kimbrough?
Yes,
Motion.
thank you. Motion is adjourned. Meeting is adjourned.
Thank you.
I don't